All right, if you're gearing up for your constitutional law exams, this is for you. We need to talk about the Indian cabinet. Now, this isn't just some dry topic. It's the absolute engine room of the government. It's where all the real power, politics, and policy come together. So let's get into it and break down exactly how this thing works.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll hit the core theory. Then we'll dive into the constitutional blueprint, the actual articles you need to know. After that, we'll walk through the history, from the early days to the messy coalition years. We'll look at that classic tug-of-war between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And we'll wrap up by looking at how the institution is still changing today.
Okay, let's start at the very beginning. Before we even get to India specifically, we've got to understand the big ideas. I mean, what is a cabinet, really? And what are the sort of unwritten rules that make it all tick?
Well, Sir Ivor Jennings really nailed it with his classic definition. He calls the cabinet the supreme directing authority. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like the government's central nervous system. It's the brain coordinating everything: defense, foreign policy, the economy, making sure the whole country is moving in one direction.
And you have to love this metaphor from Walter Bagehot. He calls the cabinet a hyphen or a buckle. It's such a brilliant way to put it because that's its most important job. It literally fastens the executive branch to the legislative branch. See, the government doesn't sit apart from Parliament, it's drawn from Parliament. And that creates this direct line of accountability right back to the people who elected them.
So these three pillars are basically the rules of the game. First up, collective responsibility. This means the cabinet has to present a united front. You sink or swim together. Second, primus inter pares. This means the prime minister is the first among equals, the leader for sure, but not an all-powerful dictator, at least in theory. And finally, political homogeneity. Basically, everyone's on the same team, ideologically speaking. These three things together are what create a stable and accountable government.
Okay, now let's see how India took these ideas and wrote them into law. We're going to get into the specific articles that define the whole system. For your exams, this is the stuff you absolutely have to know cold.
So, the original Constitution in Article 74(1) sounds pretty simple, right? It says the Council of Ministers is there to aid and advise the President. But those two words, aid and advise, were a huge deal. Why? Because they were vague. Did the President have to take the advice? It kind of left the door open for the President to do their own thing. But that door was about to get slammed shut.
And here it is. This is a massive shift in India's power structure, and you need to understand it. The 42nd Amendment came along and made the Cabinet's advice totally binding. It changed the wording to say the President shall act on the advice. No more wiggle room. Then, the 44th Amendment added a little check. The President can send the advice back for reconsideration, but only once. If the Cabinet sends it back again, the President has no choice but to sign.
You see how these articles all fit together like puzzle pieces? Article 75(1) gives the PM the power to pick their team. Article 75(3) is the big one, on accountability. It makes the whole government answerable to the Lok Sabha. And then Article 77(3) is the practical bit. It lets the president create the rules for how the government actually conducts its business day to day. It's a complete system.
Okay, so that's the law on the books. But what about reality? How did this system actually play out in India's early critical years? Well, as we're about to see, the personalities of the leaders at the time had a huge impact on how the cabinet itself was shaped.
This quote right here gets to the heart of a tension that was there from the very beginning. This is from a famous back and forth between Prime Minister Nehru and his super powerful deputy, Sardar Patel. The big question was, is the PM just the chairman of a committee, or does the PM have a special, overarching role? Nehru argued forcefully that yes, he did, and that set a really important precedent for the power of the Prime Minister's office.
And this just shows you how dramatically things changed. The early Nehru-Patel years were basically a doomvirate, a government run by two absolute giants who worked things out between them. But that model completely blew up after the Congress Party split in 1969. Indira Gandhi came out on top as the one supreme leader, and she transformed the system into one where the PM's word was law, and the cabinet's job was basically to make it happen.
Right, so the days of one party running the show eventually ended. And that gave rise to a whole new, much trickier political reality: coalition governments. Now, this wasn't just a political shift, it was a fundamental shock to the system that changed everything about how the cabinet worked.
One of the defining things about this period was this idea of outside support. You had parties popping up a government without actually joining it. As you can imagine, this was like building a government on a house of cards. The government was always vulnerable, always facing threats and policy demands, knowing that its supporters could pull the rug out from under it at any moment. It led to total instability.
And this timeline just makes that instability painfully clear. I mean, look at this. It's a revolving door of prime ministers: VP Singh, Chandrasekhar, Deve Gowda, I.K. Gujral. We're talking 4 different governments in less than a decade. And every single one of them was fragile and didn't last long, all thanks to the shaky ground of coalition politics and outside support. Now, during the UPA years, things got even more complicated. You had these new bodies pop up like the National Advisory Council, or NAC, which was a super influential group making policy from outside the government. And inside, you had tons of these groups of ministers, or GOMs, trying to build consensus. Now, the idea was probably to make things run smoother, but in reality, they often acted like parallel power centers, which just muddied the waters and sometimes overshadowed the cabinet's official authority.
So, all of this history brings us right to the main event, the central tension of the Indian executive. Who's actually running the show? Is it the Prime Minister, or is it the cabinet as a whole?
This is the big debate, and the political scientist Richard Crossman summed it up perfectly. He had this theory that government was shifting from a collective cabinet government to a much more presidential-style prime ministerial government. So for us, as students of the Constitution, the million-dollar question is, how does that theory apply to India's own wild political history?
Well, this table shows you that the answer isn't black and white. It's a spectrum. Over on the prime ministerial side, you've got dominant figures like Indira Gandhi or Rajiv Gandhi, who had massive majorities. But on the cabinet government side, you have leaders like Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was all about building consensus, or the coalition PMs of the 90s, who had no choice but to be more collaborative. Where a leader lands on this spectrum really depends on their personality, and more importantly, how much political muscle they have.
Okay, for our final section, let's look at the cabinet in a totally different way. Not just as a power center, but as a mirror of the nation. I mean, how does it even begin to represent the insane diversity of India? And what does that tell us about where it's headed?
You know, putting together a cabinet in India isn't just about picking the most qualified people. It's often called socio-political engineering. And it really is. A prime minister has to juggle a million different things, making sure different states and regions are represented, balancing various castes and communities, and keeping powerful factions within their own party happy. It's an incredibly delicate balancing act.
And this chart gives you a real-world example. If we look at a snapshot of the 2014 cabinet, you can see that balancing act translated into numbers. The breakdown here shows you the kind of complex social math that goes into these decisions. Of course, perfect representation is almost impossible, but that attempt to build a balanced social coalition is a huge unwritten part of forming a cabinet in India.
So let's wrap this up. What are the big things to remember for your exams? Number 1, the Indian cabinet is not some static thing you read about in the textbook. It's a living, breathing institution where law, politics, and powerful personalities all crash into each other. Its power is always in flux, constantly being reshaped by the PM, the Constitution, and whatever political reality is happening at the moment.
And I'll leave you with one last question to chew on. This is exactly the kind of thing you should be thinking about for your exams. In today's world, where you have a single party with a majority that still governs with coalition partners, where does that fall on our spectrum? Has it permanently blurred the line between cabinet and prime ministerial government? Thinking through that question will really take your analysis to the next level. All right, good luck with the studying.